my announcements before 8. You know, you can still watch the videos. You guys are here early. So for those of you who are here early, you'll get the announcements, and anybody who watches the video will also get the announcements. So yeah, that being said, for the next 2 minutes, let's do some announcements, some reminders. I got a great email yesterday reminding me, or asking me, / reminding me. They asked when their lab report was due, and I reminded them that it all depends on when you turned your lab report in, or your lab in, and when I graded it. So once I turned your graded lab, I specifically told you what the date was. So I can't tell you guys right now, like as a whole, as a class, all right, your due date is blah, right? It all depends. It's 2 weeks after you got your lab back. So to know your due date, go look at your lab and read the comments. I mean, you're gonna need to do that anyway. Go write a lab report. You need to be able to see what you messed up on. So speaking of reports, you know, if you need help, let me know. I'll help you do it. You don't have to go at it alone. I'm going to post some things hopefully over the weekend that'll help you get it done and help remind you where to do it, where to write it. What else about lab reports? I guess that's it for lab reports. Oh yeah, and I'll also remind you again, sometimes I'm a little bit late to grade things. Like last weekend, it was due to me traveling. But now also, sometimes I'm late to join things or I'm late to grade things on purpose. Because, like I said earlier, as long as it's turned in before I get around to grading it, I consider it on time. So, you know, when I'm slow to grade things, consider it like a gift in a way, like I'm doing it on purpose. And that would definitely be the case for the lab reports. I'm definitely going to take my time grading the lab reports, if you know what I mean. Anyway, any questions about lab reports? Okay, really quickly, the exams are all graded. They're a little bit rough than last time. Let me say this, I'm going to put this in writing later today because you guys will get to retake it. Some of them I was kind of disappointed because this is another one of those where you could get partial credit if you just got slightly the right answer. For example, all the questions that had anything to do with photosynthesis, there was only 2 proper answers. Calvin cycle or the light reactions. Not mitosis, not anything to do with respiration, but some people, a lot of people, got a lot of that wrong. Like they guessed glycolysis. For some reason, glycolysis was used a lot in photosynthesis. So those people got 0 points as opposed to half a point. So whatever your grade is, keep in mind that you did that. Whatever your grade is, even if it's bad, keep in mind that it would have been even lower if you didn't get partial credit. Like a lot of people, you know, I did that on purpose so people get partial credit. As long as you were slow, kind of where you needed to be, you got partial credit. Anyway, I'm going to post the exam again. You can retake it if you want to. You don't have to. The retake is open book. It's not time. You can do it this week. You can do it next week. I don't care. I would recommend doing it sooner than later, you know, because the longer you wait, the farther back that material is in your brain. But yeah, so that's the thing for the exam. Oh, another thing. Do you guys remember after exam 1, I said, hey, remember that video I posted for the exam review? And I said there was an extra credit question that made absolutely no sense, but if you watched that video, the answer would have been in there. I did the same thing this time. I posted a video. I said, you don't have to watch this, but I highly recommend it. And then, sure enough, there was a question that made absolutely no sense in the exam. And had you watched that video, you would have had a 10% boost to your grade. So, you know, hint, hint, I'm kind of consistent here. So, you know, maybe next time there's an exam review, and I say you don't have to watch this video, but you really should, maybe take some time out of your day, if you can, and watch it. So that's it for exams. Any questions about exams? All right. I did go past 8 o'clock, but that's okay. Get some people to show up on time. So let me take attendance. Well, there's only 1 person here. There's a lot of people online, which is good. I'm glad to see that many people up and awake on a Friday morning. So good morning, everybody online. Let me turn the slide off. You're recording, right? Yep. Yeah. Anyway, let me turn the slide off. Let's get started on the next chapter. For attendance, the first attendance word will be pumpkin. Because I'm going to pumpkin farm this weekend. And I'm excited about it. Let the kids run free. It can be relaxing for me. All right, pumpkin is the first word. Let me start this up. We are done with chapter 8. Remember, chapter 8 was basically about reproduction. Oh yeah, that's another thing people missed, and I said it in the lecture. I said, all right, and I said it a lot in the lecture. I said this chapter, or these 3 chapters on the last exam, is all about energy, right? Transforming energy from one form to another. Not only did I say it all the time, it's pretty obvious, right? Sunlight energy and the chemical energy of glucose and chemical energy in ATP. Anyway, a lot of people miss that question too. And I said that was going to be a question. I said I was going to cry when people got it wrong. And I didn't cry, but I cried on the inside. There was tears on the inside, guys. Anyway, so chapter 8 was, this last exam was about energy. Chapter 8, the one we just finished, was about reproduction, which is one of those the properties of life. And this one is about heredity, which is basically what we did in lab this week. And it's in a way also about reproduction. Of course, we were focusing on genes when we talk about it, but let's get into it. Let's do the guessing game. I won't even ask what you guys think this might be. Let's just get specific. What color would you say that girl's hair is? Of course, you're the only one here, but I might be able to hear you online. Red, right? And you can see she's got some things on her skin, right? Right. Do you think she was born with that color hair? No. Do you think she was born with those things on her skin? No, I don't either. No, I can't prove that. Who knows? But chances are she was not born that way. So, if she were to have a child with a male who had the same color hair and the same things on their skin, do you think their baby would come out with that color hair and the same things on their skin? No. For those of you online, she correctly said no, right? The babies will not come out that way. The point being, when we're talking about heredity and what's get passed down and what doesn't, not everything is inherited, right? This thing, you have to have it in your DNA. So that color hair, most likely she colored it herself, is not in her DNA. Obviously, the tattoos are not in her DNA. That being said, now I'm really going off on a tangent. Maybe there's a genetic component for like people who are predisposed to want tattoos. Who knows? There's so many genetic reasons for things that we don't even know about. Anyway, that's the story with that picture. This one, what's that a picture of? A baby, yeah. And what else? Yeah, dad holding a baby, correct. And I'm going to read my notes here to refresh myself exactly what this picture is. Oh, yeah. The idea here is, with this picture is, your sex, whether you're a male or a female, and I know I'm simplifying it, but this is biology class, so I'm simplifying it. Whether you're a male or a female, assuming you're one of those two things, you were born that way because of your father. Your father's sperm specifically determines your sex. And you're going to learn about that in this chapter. All right, in this picture, obviously that's a picture of a family, multiple generations. Your book for that picture says, your chances of inheriting and passing along a genetic disease could often be determined from your family history. So what you're seeing here is a picture. Essentially, it's a family tree in a way. It's just not set up like a family tree. But you could take all these people and put them in a family tree. I'm sure you guys have all seen family trees before. Well, we're going to look at some of those in this chapter. And using a family tree, you can determine, like, what are your chances of getting this disease? Or what are your chances of passing along this disease if you were to have kids with this person? Or if you were to have kids with that person? And there's ways to determine that. And we're going to learn about that in this chapter, chapter 9. So any questions so far? Okay. I always skip this. The beginning of your chapter always has biology and society. This one happens to deal with Darwin's dogs. Most people associate Darwin with natural selection, as they should, and we're going to talk about that later in the semester. But they also talk about dog breeding, and I will point out that dog breeding is kind of the opposite. I won't say opposite. Dog breeding is artificial selection, not natural selection. But again, we're going to talk about that a lot later. But if you're into dogs, if you like dags, as they said in that movie, good grief, Snatch? Yes, Snatch. You can read that, read all about it. I find it interesting, and if you read it, that might inspire you to write some independent work. Like if you're into dogs, look some of this stuff up. If you're into cats, for some reason, you can look that up for cats as well. Anyway, this chapter is a long one. So chapter 8 took us a while. This one's probably going to take us even longer. It is only 3 main bullet points, but look at this first main bullet point, all the stuff that's in it. So this is a long one. It's kind of complicated, I'll admit it. As an undergraduate, I had a whole course on this one chapter. So it is quite complicated. But despite the fact that it's complicated, I do kind of need to go quickly through it because we are a little bit behind. So if I ever go too fast, make sure you slow me down if you need to, or send me an email afterwards and say, hey, listen, you really glossed over that. Can you re-explain that concept? Anyway, the first thing we're talking about is genetics and heredity. First of all, you need to know what heredity is. Heredity is the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. Transmission of traits, one generation to the next. That is what your book says. Independent work topic here. That's what your book says. You can look it up from other sources and see what other sources say. And I know I don't normally recommend doing that because I want you to learn something outside of what you learned in class, but this would be interesting to see what other sources say. Like if we're talking about transmission of traits, are we only talking about, genetic traits? Or what about behavioral traits, right? Like if you have abusive parents, most likely, or physically abusive parents, most likely their parents were abusive, and most likely those kids will be abusive. It's a cycle, right? It's hard to break. Anyway, you can look that up if you want. Next word you need to know is genetics. As you already know from the lab, of course, this version is slightly different. In your book, we call it the scientific study of heredity. If I remember correctly, the lab called it the study of heredity. But I like the way this textbook goes in that word scientific, right? Because we talked about that in chapter 1, the difference between the study of life versus the scientific study of life, right? So this is the scientific study of heredity. For example, you might say that the study of heredity, not scientific, the study of heredity, you might say somebody who does those family trees, the genealogy, right? Somebody might say that's the study of heredity. I don't know. Not that you need to know any of that for the exam. All right. I like the way your book presents this chapter. So there's this guy. His name is Gregor Mendel. This dude right here. He's kind of like the father of genetics. So your book does a decent job of presenting this chapter almost like a story. Like, hey, here's what he learned. And as you learn what he learned, as I tell you what he learned and how he learned it, then you learn it, right? So this is kind of like a story. It's not a lot like a story because it's still a textbook, but we'll do the best I can. So you do need to know that guy's name. You don't necessarily need to know this was in the 1860s, but that'll come back later. Not the fact, again, you're not going to need to know that, but it will come back later when we talk about Darwin. Because Darwin and Mendel were kind of doing the same thing, or doing things close to the same time, and it's interesting that they never really knew each other's work, because that would have been a game changer. But anyway, Gregor Mendel, he argued that parents pass down unique genes to their offspring. We already know that, but back in the day, they didn't know that. And I put a star next to that word genes because that's what they are, they're genes. But back then, they didn't have that word genes. He used the term heritable traits. Now, obviously, people realized, even back in the 1860s, people said, well, this person who looks like this mated with this person that looks like this, and then their offspring look a little bit like them, right? So they knew that, but he was getting a little bit more specific. He was saying that the specific part was these things, these genes. Again, he didn't call them genes, but he was saying that there was something specific they were passing along. But we'll talk about that later. Oh, so by the way, sorry, I should have said this before I talk about this. If you take notes, you don't necessarily need to write any of this down, because this is an introduction. We're going to dive deeper into each of these bullet points. So anyway, yes, that's one of the things he argued. He also argued that genes, and again, he didn't call them genes, are responsible for the inherited traits. Again, let's leave it at that. He also argued that genes retain their individual identities generation after generation, no matter how they're mixed up or temporarily masked. A good example of that would be, just me. It's a good example because I know it, I've lived it. My grandmother has blue eyes. None of her offspring have blue eyes, including my mom. I have blue eyes, right? So that gene for the blue eyes, it didn't disappear. It was just masked for a generation. It was gone for a generation. It just wasn't showing up, but it was still in there. Of course, he didn't know DNA at the time, but it was there in the DNA. My mom had it in her DNA. It just wasn't expressed. So that was actually really ahead of his time. And of course, we read this and we're thinking, yeah, no duh, I know this, right? You probably already know this. But, he's the one that really figured all this stuff out. So the fact that you know it means, you can kind of thank him. Of course, somebody else probably figured that out eventually. But anyway, let's move forward if there's no questions about this slide. All right, like I said, your book is kind of giving this like a story. So the first thing we're talking about is where he did his work, which is in Abbey Garden. We'll talk about where he did his work and exactly what he did. First thing we need to tell you, even though you don't need to know this for the exam, so I'm going to put it next to it, is that he studied garden peas, right? So when he did his research, he did it on garden peas. So usually, I don't know, before I was a biologist, when I used to think about like doing studies, like scientific studies, I think of mice. For some reason, that's always what popped into my mind, right? Scientists working with mice or lab rats. He worked on peas. Why did he work on peas? Because they were easy to grow, and they came in many readily distinguishable varieties. Easy to grow is a good one, right? So, if he wants to work with plants, probably working on redwood trees would not be good, right? Because it takes thousands of years for them to grow. That would not be good. So you need something that can grow quickly, like a pea plant, or something that'll be small, relatively small, like a pea plant. You don't want something huge. Comes in many readily distinguishable varieties. That makes sense, right? Because if you take Bermuda grass or whatever species of grass you're looking at, you probably don't want to use that because even probably people who study grass, like the species probably looks the same, right? And there's probably not very, very many distinguishable varieties of a certain species of grass. But anyway, he used garden peas. Now you know why. You don't need to for the exam. Let's move forward. These two words are important. You need to know them. You need to understand the differences between them when I use them. And it's easy to mix up. So a character is a heritable feature that varies among individuals. For example, hair color is a character. A trait is a variant of that character. So red hair would be a trait of the character hair color. Blonde hair would be a trait of the character hair color. Brown hair would be a trait of the character hair color. Of course, for peas, we're not talking about hair color, but for humans, that makes sense, right? Hopefully that's something you guys are all familiar with. So please make sure you understand the difference between those two words. One, because I might test you on it, and two, because I don't want you to get confused when I'm using them in the lecture. So each character that Mendel studied occurred in two distinct traits. That's also important. Not important for the exam, so I'll put it next to it. I'm not going to ask you that. But for him to figure things out, you really need to study things that were simple. And two distinct traits is very simple, right? So if you're studying humans, one character you don't want to study, well, I should say you wouldn't want to. If you want a simple study, you wouldn't want to study height, right? Because when you think about all the different traits, it's not like there's short people and tall people. It's not like everyone's 6'6" and 5'6", right? There's everywhere in between. So that's not two distinct traits. Even hair color wouldn't be good, right? Because like I just said, you got brown, and I'm simplifying this anyway, brown, blonde, and red, right? Or black. Right? Even that's not even two distinct shades, right? That's four. And also there's different shades, and we won't even get into that. Even eye color is a little bit more complicated, right? Because you've got blue and brown, and then hazel, and then again, all the different in-betweens. So you want something with two distinct traits. Like the flower is either this color or the flower is that color. Nowhere in between, nothing else. That's what he studied. That's why he studied it. Any questions about that slide? All right. Put a big X to this. I'm just explaining again why he did what he did. But I'm not going to ask you about it. There might be questions about it on the study guide that I don't remember. But an important advantage of the pea plant that he studied is that he could strictly control the reproduction. So again, humans, ethically, wouldn't be great to study for genetics. Well, there's exceptions to that. I'll talk about it later. But the way I'm describing genetics, they wouldn't be good to study because it's not ethical to be right. I want you to have sex with you, and so I can study your offspring. I want you to have sex with you so I can study your offspring. And I want this offspring of yours to have sex with that offspring of theirs. You can't do that. That's not ethical. Well, pea plants, it's A-okay. He could control it. That was ethical, and he really could physically do it, which is also important. And let's talk about how, really quickly, because I'm not going to ask you about this. So with these flowers, the petals enclose the egg-producing organ called the carpel, and the sperm-producing organ called the stamens. So flowers, depending on which kind you're looking at, but these flowers are both male and female, right? So this plant is male and female. Even that one flower is male and female, it has both parts. So consequently, these flowers usually, like in nature, would self-fertilize, right? And I know this sounds really weird and gross, but hopefully this will help it stick in your mind. This would be like if a human had a penis and a vagina and testicles and ovaries and a uterus, and was somehow, because it has all the stuff, I don't know, maybe if you wore underwear too tight, you run the risk of getting yourself pregnant, right? That's basically what we're talking about there, right? These plants, because they have everything they need wrapped up in those petals, they could and often do make themselves pregnant, so to speak. Pregnant's not the word we use in plants, but that's okay in botany. But that's what it is, right? There's the parts, there's the petal, there's the stamens, right? There's the carpel. It's all right there. I'm not going to test you on this, so I'm going to move forward. There's a good question for the video, though. Let me ask that. There will be a video question where it says, what color is the petal? You can see right there it's purple. Because we're going to look at other petals later that are different colors. So to fertilize one plant, I'll put another X to this to remind you this is still stuff. I'm just giving you background. I'm not going to test you on it. To fertilize one plant with the pollen from a different plant, he did it by hand, right? So that way he was always sure that this plant and this plant made it, right? It was never just like they were out in the garden and the wind was blowing around and pollinating insects were going from one to the next, right? It wasn't like that. He controlled it. So this is a picture showing you what he did. You can see here, he's cutting off the stamens of this purple flower plant. And he's taking a little brush and taking the pollen from the stamens of that white flower plant and putting it onto the carpel of that plant, right? So he's controlling it. He knows that this thing hasn't self-fertilized because he got rid of the stamens. He knows that the pollen that impregnated, if you will, this flower came from that flower. He was in control. Again, I'm not going to test you on this, but this is important in a way because hopefully as college-educated students or humans, hopefully you think about things. And I almost hope for everything I say you think, well, how do we know that? So this is just a little bit of how do we know that? How do we know we didn't mess up his experiment? So it's just a little background on there. Anyway, what happens is you impregnate the flower, it makes seeds, and when you think about it, if I'm still using humans as an example, the seeds are basically little babies, right? There's a bunch of little babies ready to go. That's what seeds are. Seeds are plant babies. Anyway, you put the seeds in the ground, and as you guys already probably know, then they grow up. And then you get plants, and the circle of life continues. So once again, a big old X to this because I'm not going to ask you this on the exam. The next slide gives you some words you do need to know. Probably one of the first questions on the study guide. What is a purebred? Well, what he did, created purebred varieties of these pea plants. And a purebred is something that self-fertilizes to produce offspring identical to the parent. Put a little circle around that because you need to know it. A purebred is something that self-fertilizes to produce offspring identical to the parent. So if you take a white flower and it's a purebred white flower and you self-fertilize it, like its stamen and its carpels come together, right, and make a baby, so to speak, it will be just like the white parent. So any questions about what a purebred is? All right. So when you cross two purebreds, that gives you a hybrid. And you need to know what a hybrid is too, biologically speaking. And now I'll go ahead and tell you there's going to be a test question where I ask you what a hybrid is. And one of the options is going to be a car that runs on gasoline and electricity, and someone's going to get it, and that's wrong. And I'm telling you right now, that's the wrong answer because we're talking about biology, right? So the answer is not a vehicle. Hybrids are offspring of two different purebred varieties. So a purebred white flower plant and a purebred purple flower plant. You put those together, and then the offsprings are called hybrids. You need to know that. The action of doing that, when you take this thing and you mate it with this thing, that's called a genetic cross. You need to know that. When you do that cross-fertilization, that is a genetic cross. So when I take this one purebred and combine it with this purebred for the genetic cross, those two purebreds, that's called the P generation. You need to know that. That'll be useful. We're going to use that a lot. So the P generation, I almost think of it as the parental generation. Or like it says right here, parental plants, P generation. It's easy to think of. P, right? It's all right there. That's the P generation. So again, you cross them, they have offspring. Those offspring are called the F1 generation. And if you want a dirty way to remember that, this is not what F stands for, but think about the dirty word for breeding, right? So when they F'd, this is the first generation, right? And then that generation F'd, And then that gives you their offspring, which is the F2 generation. For independent work, you can look that up. What does F actually stand for? Because it's not the dirty thing I just told you. But again, hopefully that'll be the easy way for you to remember. So remember, you got the P generation, and then their offspring of the F1 generation. And then when you cross them, which again would be horrible if you did it with humans, because that's what you're talking about, like siblings crossing, horrible. And then that gives you the F2 generation. Any questions about this slide? The next word for attendance, I'm going to circle it. One of my favorite bands. The lead singer actually, for the longest time, has had a master's degree in biotechnology, like me, but he recently got his PhD. Anyway, that circled word is the next word for attendance. Any questions about this slide? Okay, if you remember, in chapter 8 at the end, I told you something simple. It was called independent assortment. And I said it's a pretty simple concept, because basically what we're saying is, when your chromosomes line up in metaphase, homologous chromosomes, these are homologous chromosomes. It's not like all the mom chromosomes line up on one side and all the dads line up on the other, right? It's not like that. Sometimes, it flops around. It's all random. The way they line up, mom and dad, mom and dad, mom and dad, it's completely random. And there's 8 million different ways that could happen when you produce your egg or your sperm, right? That is called independent assortment. I told you when I taught you that that's not too complicated until the next chapter, when I give you another word that sounds kind of similar, and that'll confuse things for you on the exam. So here it is. Here's that word that kind of sounds familiar or similar, and this is the law of segregation. That's what we're about to talk about. Law of segregation. So Mendel performed experiments, and when he did this, he tracked the inheritance of characters, for example, flower color, or plant height, or the color of the peas, right? All these things that occur as 2 alternative traits. I already said that. I'm going to put it next to this again, because I'm still just giving you backstory. It's nothing I'm going to ask you about. So again, it's 2 distinct traits he was looking at. When he was looking at the character, they only had 2 distinct traits. It wasn't like human height, right? It wasn't whether it could be all kinds of different traits. The results led him to formulate several hypotheses about inheritance. I'm going to show you what those hypotheses are, but first I'm going to really quickly show you some of these different characters he looked at. So, right, the character of flower color, the character of flower position, seed color, seed shape, pod color, stem length. All these things had 2 distinct traits. They were either purple or they were white. There was never any situation where there was some third color or where they were in between. Same thing with the seed color, right? They were either yellow or they were green. There were never a mixture of the 2. There was never some third color. There was never white ones, right? Everything he looked at was 2 distinct traits, which is very helpful because, as I said, he's the father of genetics. So you need to start off with very simple things like this. And then obviously since this, geneticists have gotten a lot more complicated, but we wanted to keep it started off simple. So let's talk about his hypotheses. And the first thing we want to talk about is a monohybrid cross. Can anybody tell me what the prefix mono means? No guesses? No. Mono? All right. It means one, basically, especially in this context. So a monohybrid cross is a cross between the purebred parents that differ in only one character. So the hybrid, remember we talked about what a hybrid is. When you mix 2 purebreds, you get a hybrid, right? So the mono means this particular hybrid is a hybrid that only differs in one character, right? So we looked at all those characters earlier. I showed you like pea color, flower color, height, all that stuff I showed you. When he did these studies, when he did a monohybrid cross, he said, all right, this plant is going to be the same with everything, except it's going to be only different with their flower color, for example, whatever it is. A monohybrid cross only looks at one character. You need to know that. So an example, again, like I said earlier, a purple flower, if you breed a purebred purple flower plant with a purebred white flower plant, that would be a monohybrid cross because you're only looking at that one character of flower color. When he did that, here's where it gets a little bit interesting, 100% of the time when he did that, he did this thousands of times, every single one of the F1 generation, so all the offspring of that mating, were all purple. Right? This is how he started his experiments. He's like, all right, purebred purple, purebred white. Did it thousands of times. Every single time he did it, without fail, every single one of the offspring had purple flowers, right? So that obviously had to lead them to question, what happened to the factor? He didn't know it was called a gene back then, but what happened to the gene for the white flower? Was it lost? Where did it go? And then he took those, right, all those purple flowers, those thousands of purple flowers, and he crossed them with each other. And then he looked at the F1 generation, he looked at the F2 generation, which was their offspring, and found out the answer is no. The gene for the white flower did not disappear. It just happened to be gone for the F1 generation. Like I was talking about with the blue eyes, my grandparents and my mom and myself. So here's what I'm saying. There's the P generation, that's a purebred purple flower and a purebred white flower. He crossed them, right? And in this picture, it doesn't give it justice because it shows these two plants make this one plant. That's not how it went, right? He actually did this many times. So it was more than 2 plants, it was thousands, right? He did this a lot. And they obviously didn't have one offspring. They also had thousands, right? So these numbers are very simplified. So, but the one part that is true is it is 100% without fail, unless I'm wrong in that. I mean, I'm sure, things do go weird with nature sometimes. But as far as I know, I don't think he ever had anything other than the purple flowers. But definitely what was expected is 100% for sure. Anyway, so 100% of the offspring were purple. Then, like I said, he was like, wait a minute, how did that happen? What happened to the gene? Of course, he didn't call it gene. What happened to the gene for the white flower? Did they disappear? I don't know. Let me run an experiment. Let me take these thousands of F1 purple plants and breed them with themselves and see what the outcome is. And then sure enough, there it was again. The white color came back. And again, this is oversimplification. We didn't just have this one plant and we crossed it with itself and it had 4 plants for offspring, right? We're talking about thousands. And what he found, again, this is just simplification, but what he found was about 75% of this F2 generation were purple and about 25% were white. So it didn't disappear, right? He learned that the factor, or gene as we call it, that squiggly line means about, right? About 75, about 35, or 25. He learned that gene did not disappear. He also learned that there's some kind of ratio there. 3/4 of the plants were one color, 1/4 were the other. So again, that had to make him think, what in the world was going on? And I know for us, it's nothing, especially if you're just a bored college student sitting, listening to genetics because you have to graduate. But for him, he's like, this is really interesting stuff. He's like, what in the world is going on? Why is it that I always get this ratio? Ratio is not always exact, but it was about 75% to 25%. So again, like I said, the gene for the white flower did not disappear. It was just hidden when the purple gene was present. And as you already know from lab, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you this a little bit later in the chapter, but as you already know from lab, that's because the purple gene is dominant and the white gene is recessive. The dominant gene, the purple allele, which I haven't formally introduced you to that word yet in this chapter, which is why it says gene, but really it's an allele. The purple allele is dominant to the white allele. Anyway, so those F1 plants, the ones that were 100% purple, even though they were purple, that was their phenotype. Their genotype, right? They still had two genes, as your book is calling it at this point, but we know it as alleles. They had the 2 alleles. They had an allele for purple and an allele for white. So even though they were purple, they still had that allele for white. Just like my mom, even though she has brown eyes, she still has that gene that allele that she gave me for blue eyes, right? It's still there. It's just the brown is dominant to blue. So the fact that she has the allele for blue eyes didn't matter for her because the brown said, no, you don't. You're going to be brown eyes. I'm dominant. Anyway, any questions about this? All right, the next word for attendance, let's just do a name based on this. And the next name for attendance will be John Lennon. So he's saying about giving peace a chance. That's all he's saying. You can look that up if you want. Not for independent work, just for your own musical knowledge. Okay, like I said earlier, he did all this work. He came up with some important hypotheses. Let's talk about them. You need to know them. 4 hypotheses. First of all, there are alternative versions of genes that account for variations in inherited characters, which you already know. That's a long-winded way of saying alleles exist, right? Because of lab, you already know what an allele is. And again, I'm going to formally introduce you to that term later, but yes, alleles exist. So for the flower color, there's different versions. It's purple or is it white for that particular plant. For eye colors, there's blue, brown, other things. So yes, you figured that out. There are alternative versions of genes that account for variations in inherited characters. You need to know that. Like I said, it's called an allele. Lucky for you guys, you already know that from the lab. Number 2, for each inherited character, flower color for example, the organism inherits 2 alleles, one from each parent. Now that part is true, regardless. Even if you're talking about something where there's more than 2 versions, you're only getting 2 versions, right? You get one from your mom, one from your dad. So hair color is a good example for that. Well, no, it's not. Not if you really dig into it. So just leave it at that, right? For each inherited character, an organism inherits 2 alleles, one from each parent. You already know that. Any questions about this so far? Here's some more information you already know from lab. If an organism has 2 identical alleles, it is said to be homozygous for that character. So because, and I'm only just saying this because it's me and I've been using the same example the whole time, because I have blue eyes, that means I have 2 blue eye alleles, right? 2 recessive alleles, so I'm homozygous. I have to be, because I have a recessive trait. My recessive phenotype, right? I know for a fact that I am homozygous recessive. But what do you call it when you have both, like my mom? Because like I said, she had brown eyes, but clearly, since she had me, and I can tell from DNA tests that I'm not adopted or anything, she clearly, even though she has brown eyes, she must have had the allele for blue eyes. So what do you call that? As you already know from the lab, that is called heterozygous. Know these words. You will be tested on them. We will use them. And if you haven't done the lab yet, which is due tonight, hopefully that'll help you remember some of these words. Any questions about what we have up here so far? All right, here's a meme I found on the internet. I didn't make it. Heterozygotes, obviously it's a different spelling, but it's a little bit hard to see, but at the bottom it says, just a little uneven. I love it. But, I'm a biologist and a dad, so you make biology jokes with dad jokes, and you get stuff like this. Anyway, number 3, if 2 alleles differ, right? So again, I guess you could say if you're heterozygous by it, this is one way of saying that, then one of those alleles is going to determine the appearance, and that thing is said to be dominant, and the other one has no noticeable effect, and it is said to be recessive. You already know that from the exam. So let's give you an example, and this is where I'm really going to get into this detail later, so don't write anything down yet. This is a preview. We'll talk about this later in the chapter, but we're talking about those purple flowers, right? We're talking about genes, we're talking about DNA, right? We're talking about 2 of the same, or one of the same genes with just different versions, right? So what happened is there was a mutation. We're talking about these flowers anyway. One of those genes, one of those alleles, is information that says produces protein. And that protein is probably some enzyme that makes the chemical reaction happen that says, all right, this is how you make the purple color, right? And that's why the purple. But there was probably some mutation. So then that gene got broken. So the gene's still there, but now because of the mutation, the thing folds the wrong way and it's like an enzyme that just doesn't work. So now this thing's making this protein and the flower doesn't have the enzyme it needs to make the purple color. So it doesn't make the purple color, right? So if you have 2 of those alleles, one of them says make purple, the other one's just broken, it doesn't do anything. Then of course, if the dominant one, that's how the dominant one would be dominant, because it says make purple, and the plant doesn't make purple. The other one doesn't say anything. So the one, you're still just making purple. All right, when we write these things down, as you already know from the lab, we use uppercase italic letters for dominant, and we use lowercase italic letters for recessive. I hate using P's too, because when you're drawing it, it's hard to distinguish between the uppercase P and the lowercase p. But yeah. Also, I had a great question in lab yesterday. Is it always, like when you're writing something for heterozygote, does it always have to be big P, little p? No, it doesn't. You can also do little p, big P. We just happen to always, we usually do big P, little p, but it really doesn't matter. Anyway, Any questions about number 3? This is all basically a refresher from what you got in lab. All right, number 4. A sperm or egg, aka a gamete, carries only one allele for each inherited character because the 2 alleles for a character segregate during the production of gametes. You already know this. There's a long-winded way of saying your sperm or your egg only have one allele, right? Because those alleles are on chromosomes, homologous chromosomes. And when they split up, you only get one of the 2 versions. So again, if you were to look at my mom's cells, any cell in her body, if you were to look at the gene for eye color, you would see, or the gene, right? Or if you look at her chromosomes, you would see she has 2 alleles for eye color, brown and blue. You would see that. Now, if you were to look at her eggs, remember, those alleles segregate. So if you were looking at her eggs, 50% of them are, they're all only going to have one allele, right? Because those alleles segregate. Remember, you get half the genetic information in the egg. So if you were to look at all of them, 50% of them would have that blue allele, and 50% of them would have the brown allele. That's what this is saying. So what color eyes do you have? Hazel, that's too complicated. That's a whole different story. I was going to use an example, but we're behind. I'll just leave it at that. What I'll do is I'll find there's a good short video by Hank, those videos that I've posted. Actually, I've already posted it. It's in the lab. Watch the video in the lab. He does a great job of talking about this. It's a lot more entertaining. And also you get points for it if you answer the questions. Anyway, yeah, so when you make sperm and you make eggs, your alleles segregate. So any sperm or egg you look at, it's only going to have one allele for a particular character. That is what the law of segregation is. You need to know that. You need to know the law of segregation. And obviously the law of segregation is a lot different than independent assortment. But to me, maybe it's just me, I don't know. When I was an undergrad in Bio 120, which is like the biology version of this course, for some reason I always got those 2 confused. Maybe you won't, but yeah, that's the law of segregation. The law of segregation says that a sperm or egg only carries one allele for a given character. Another way of saying that, because right now we're zoomed into a particular gene, if you were to zoom out and look at the whole chromosome, you could also say the law of segregation states that a sperm or egg carries only one chromosome, one of each of the homologous chromosomes. So remember, for example, you have 2 of each chromosome. You got 2 number 1 chromosomes, 2 number 2 chromosomes, 2 number 3 chromosomes, 2 number 4 chromosomes. So any of those chromosomes that you look at, because of the law of segregation, you only have one of those particular pair of chromosomes. That is the law of segregation. They segregate in meiosis. Any questions about this slide? All right, let's see. The next word for attendance will be, here we go, game. There's all kinds of games going on this weekend. Our matches ready for soccer, it's a match. We've got matches, we've got American football games, all kinds of stuff. Good time to remind you too, you can get extra credit for going, contact me for details. If you can prove that you were there, if you posted to social media to help, yeah, that's right. So anyway, let's move forward. This will look familiar. This is everything I've said, but now we're throwing in the grief. Why can't I think today? The box here, where we look at the possible outcomes. Good grief. Anyway, this is all the stuff that we did in lab, and also all the stuff that I've already talked about. It's all combined into one picture. Here we have the parental generation, the purebred purple flower versus a purebred white flower. You can see here, and I wish they wouldn't do it this way. Yes, all the alleles that this thing has is for big P, right? Because, they do, never mind. Big P, right? This one, all of them are little p. Now granted, there's still 2 alleles at first, but then they go through meiosis and they segregate, right? So then, well, because it's all big P, no matter which sperm or egg you look at, it's going to have a big P. Yes, they're segregated, but because the only thing this thing had to offer was big P, 100% of the sperm and egg are going to be big P. Same here. For these white flowers, little p, little p. Yeah, they segregate, right, in meiosis. So you're only going to get one of those alleles, not 2 of them. But because the only thing this white flower had to offer was the little p, then 100% of the sperm and the egg are going to be little p. So then you put those things together, right? what happens when you combine a big P and a little p? Well, you get big P, little p, right? It's heterozygous. But because purple is dominant to white, then 100% of these flowers are going to be purple. Because 100% of them are heterozygous. There is no other possibility. When you combine a big P and a small p, you're going to get a big P, little p. So 100% have that genotype. Therefore, 100% have the purple phenotype. Then it gets a little bit more complicated. When that purple flower, this one right here, when it goes through meiosis, that big P separates from that little p. Just like this big P separated from the big P, and the little p separated from the little p, just like they did. But except in this case, they're different. So if you were to look at all the sperm and all the eggs in that purple flower, if you could somehow do it, look at every single one of them, you would find 50% of them have the big P, and 50% of them have the small p. So obviously, this is just a simplification, right? It's not like this thing's producing 2 sperm, right? One of them happens to be a big P, one of them happens to be a small p. No, there's millions of them. And of those millions, half of those millions are going to be big P, half of them are going to be small p. So then you combine them, right? So you combine them randomly, right? You're combining maybe millions of, hundreds of thousands or millions, whatever, a bunch of sperm and a bunch of eggs. You put them together. What are the chances of getting particular offspring? Well, that's what the Punnett square is for. I remember the word, Punnett square, right? So you have a big P, little p, sperm, and a big P, little p egg, right? So the sperm is either going to be big P or little p, big P or little p. It won't be both because they segregate. So what are the possibilities? Well, there's a 50% chance that you'll have a big P, 50% chance you have a big P. Those things come together to have big P, or a big P coming together with a little p, or another big P coming together with a big P, big P, little p, and then little p, little p. But here's where it's something that's important for the exam. When we're talking about a monohybrid cross, there's that word again. That's what I know. I introduced that word and kind of left it, but we've been talking about a monohybrid cross this whole time. When we're talking about a monohybrid cross, you should recognize this ratio, the genotypic ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. Forget the P's. What we're saying is a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. What we would expect of a monohybrid cross of the heterozygotes. And that ratio is a little bit less important. I'm giving it to you because there will be a test question. There is a question on the study guide. But I guess in the grand scheme of understanding this whole semester, if you don't get that, and it's really complicated to you, don't sweat it. You can understand other stuff later in the semester without understanding this. And there's only going to be like one question, so it's not going to hurt you very too much. But anyway, that's a Punnett square. You should be familiar with it for the lab. If I have time and you need help, we could just meet and go through each one of those from that table too and say, all right, what are you? You're this. What's the person you made it with? That. All right, let's do this Punnett square together. And I can show you how to do it and show you what it means. Right. Anyway, yeah, that's what happens when you cross 2 heterozygotes, right? You get 1 homozygote, well, 25%, because remember, when these things happen, you're going to have more than 4 offspring. But, so let's say it like it is. If these were thousands of plants, you would say about 25% of them would be homozygous dominant, about 50% of them would be heterozygotes, and about 25% of them would be homozygous recessive. Anyway, that's the genotype ratio. Now, when it comes to phenotype, homozygous dominant, and the heterozygotes, they're all going to be purple because that's the dominant allele, right? So you'll have about 75% of them will have the dominant phenotype, and about 25% will have the recessive phenotype. Any questions about that? All right, the next slide is basically what I just told you, but it's in writing. A Punnett square highlights the 4 possible combination of gametes, which are the 4 possible offspring. Each square represents an equally probable product of fertilization. Again, you can see the previous slide for a picture of what I just said. But any questions about that? Okay. Let's see. Yep, we can go through this really quickly because you already know this. Let's talk about genetic alleles and homologous chromosomes. The physical appearance is the phenotype. The genetic makeup is the genotype. Or as your lab described it, the genotype is the combination of alleles you have, and the phenotype is the result of that. I like that better. So this is definitely one of those situations where you do need to know these words, but when you need one of those situations where you don't necessarily need to memorize the definition verbatim. If it's just a bunch of words to you and you don't even know what those words mean, it doesn't matter. So make sure you understand the concept. The genotype, right, it's which alleles you have. And the phenotype is the result of that. And I like that better than the way they said it in the book, physical appearance. Because there's some genotypes that cause phenotypes that are not visible. Sickle cell disease is a phenotype, but you can't see it. There's certain things that put you at higher risk of breast cancer, for example. That would be a phenotype, but you can't see it. Anyway, each character we're still talking about what he did in his experiments. Each character had the same inheritance pattern, which is where the parental trait disappeared, like the white color in that example disappeared in the F1 generation. And he bred all those F1 generations together and looked at their offspring, which is the F2 generation. And that thing reappeared in about 25% of the F2 generation. Next thing I'm going to say really quickly is another word you already know. Homologous chromosomes. Those are chromosomes that have alleles of the same genes. So you notice the definition is a little bit different in this chapter than it is last chapter because we're just studying different things. So in the context of genetics, a homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that have alleles of the same genes. So again, I'm just making this up, but if there's a gene for back hair and it's on chromosome number 17 for her, and it's also on chromosome number 17 for me, and every other human on Earth, the gene for back hair would be on chromosome number 17. And not only would it also be on chromosome number 17, I'm gonna draw it right here, it doesn't really look like this, but let's say that's chromosome number 17, and I'm saying that the gene for back hair is on chromosome number 17 for every human. Not only that, but if it's right here on her chromosome, right there at the very tip, then it's also right there on my chromosome and every other human being on Earth, and that's called the gene locus. So not only is it on the same chromosome, it's also in the same place. So the gene locus, which should be easy to remember because it sounds a little bit like location, right? The gene locus is the specific location of a gene on a chromosome. So here's a picture of everything I'm just saying. There you go. There's two homologous chromosomes. One came from your mom, one came from your dad. You have gene alleles, right? The genes are at the same place. For whatever gene P is, it's right there for all the chromosomes, A, B. So, any questions about that? Last word for attendance is going to be rules. So no one's here to do the Red Friday thing, but you can still participate on your own if you want. Just let me know how, and you can get just a little bit of extra credit for doing it. That's it. Speaking of which, the Friday before Veterans Day, you'll get even more extra credit for wearing red. Obviously, that's a bigger deal on that day.
What's up?
November 11th is Veterans Day. Have a good weekend. Good luck.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So I got proof in like my connections start going out, but I got 3 out of 4 of the key attendance words.
Okay. Yeah. You want to go find the other ones, not just because of the words, because obviously it's not your fault, but because your internet was going out, that means you missed some of the lecture, right? It's not your fault, but obviously you need to get some of the lecture, whatever you missed, because it's important that you get the lecture. So whatever words you missed, once I post the video, you can just find them and you can get full credit for it at that point.
So I just find the keyword.
Yeah, send what you have already, and then I'll reply, and like you said, you got this many out of this many. And then after I post the video, then you can, send me the rest. You can watch it and find the rest.
Okay.
Because it's less about the keywords, more, like I said, more about just getting, the lecture. So even though it's not your fault, you missed part of the lecture, so you need to get that. And I'll say, not since we're still recording, this isn't directed to you, but to anybody watching the video, it's a good time to remind you that, it's just the risk you run if you decide to do class online. Because this is an in-person class, but if you decide to do it online, sometimes there could be something wrong on your end or something wrong on my end. So it's just the risk we take. But good question. Anybody else? All right. For any of those of you who came in on time, I'll let you know that I did some announcements before we started. So if you did see those, feel free to go back and watch the video.